that it is absolutely necessary for countries to cooperate more closely together and to organize international organizations which will foster peace. It acknowledges the already existing structures, and then in paragraph 86 outlines the norms for cooperation. They include the need for development and not just foreign aid from advanced nations, the regulation of economic relations and international business affairs. It warns against solutions to address the increase in world population that are contrary to moral law. Gaudium et Spes concludes, as it began, with hope, that men and women will be aroused to a lively hope, the gift of the Holy Spirit, that someday at last they will be caught up in peace and utter happiness, radiant with the glory of the Lord. In looking at the response to Gaudium et Spes, and I do have to tell you that this won't surprise you, anything that happened in the church after Vatican II was said to have come from Vatican II. So everybody takes credit, but I tried to pick out some things that certainly, that followed in the sense of the documents. One of the really good responses of the Universal Church was the establishment of the Council on Justice and Peace by Pope Paul VI in 1967. In Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 90, proposed that, considering the immensity of the hardships which still afflict the greater part of humankind today, an organism of the Universal Church should be set up in order that both the justice and love of Christ toward the poor might be developed everywhere, and where the Catholic community would be stimulated to foster progress in needy regions and social justice on the international scene. As you heard from Bishop Malloy, I was privileged to be a member of the Council. I think it was in the 1990s. And the Council has produced major documents that carry forth the content and spirit of the Council, particularly Gaudium et Spes. Perhaps the Council is best known for the series of World Day of Peace statements. The commemoration of the World Day of Peace began in 1968 and continues to this day. The World Day of Peace statement for 2013, chosen by Benedict, was "Blessed are the Peacemakers." Bishop William Murphy of Rockville Center, who I mentioned earlier, your previous speaker, worked at the Justice and Peace Council. In fact, we used to say that when Bishop Murphy worked there, we always got the World Day of Peace statement in time that we could actually do something with it. No offense to the Italians, but he was a lot better at it. During Bishop Murphy's time, the Council also produced a statement on the guidelines for teaching seminarians about justice and peace issues. And in 2004, the Council produced the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which renewed and updated the social teaching of the Church based in Gaudium et Spes. It is a kind of catechism, if I may use that word, of social teaching. Besides the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, there was another major event that affirmed Gaudium et Spes, and that was the Special Synod of Bishops in 1985, marking the 20th anniversary of the Council. It recognized that the signs of the times are different, with increasing problems of hunger, oppression, injustice, and terrorism requiring a much more profound theological reflection. A key structure called for by the Council, that was the document called Christus Dominus, was the Episcopal Conference of Bishops. In more recent times, Episcopal conferences in individual countries or groups of countries have served as a vehicle for the Church to engage with government. Now, that's not all they do. They're mostly a federation of bishops. They work pastorally. But even in other countries, you often read about the Conference of Bishops somehow engaging the government of the country. In the U.S., the Catholic War Council, which was the precursor of the conference, was established in 1917. It eventually became the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, United States Catholic Conference, in 1966. In 1968, the U.S. bishops established a National Advisory Council, which is composed of bishops, clergy, religious, and laity, who represent the 15 regions of the United States as a kind of church in miniature, offering advice and counsel to the bishops. As I mentioned, the Episcopal Conference in this country was divided into two bodies, the United States Catholic Conference and the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. One was sort of inside the church structure, and the other was the public policy arm. Each had committees of bishops and staff who carried out the work of the conference. And then the two arms of the conference were officially joined in 2001 to create what we have now, which is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB. Now, the primary way in which the current USCCB interacts with society in the US is through the political process. Advocating for change through legislation is seen as a necessary way for the church to try to influence society. And other religious organizations have established similar structures to bring their concerns to the attention of policymakers. Early on in my work, there was a process within Catholic Charities which was called the Cadre Study, and that also resulted in more focus on advocacy in government policies. Catholic Relief Services, well known for its relief work in many countries throughout the world, began to shift its focus to development as called for in Gaudium et Spes, and eventually embraced advocacy as a strategy, and now has a very robust presence on Capitol Hill. In the individual states, bishops of the state coordinate their advocacy efforts under the state Catholic conferences like you have here in Illinois. There are 38 such Catholic conferences, and they interact regularly with governors and state legislatures. Current issues that state conferences are taking up include life and marriage issues, education, and threats to human dignity, such as hunger and homelessness. Advocacy for public policies that promote Catholic principles typically involve identifying issues for the bishops of the country or the state, and then seeking opportunities to testify before congressional committees or send letters to them at the federal level or here in your houses in the individual states. What has been added to that process over the past 25 years is more of a grassroots element that can be activated when there's a particular piece of legislation to be supported or opposed. And again, you have that kind of process here in Illinois through your own Catholic conference. While this effort has been effective on certain pieces of legislation, nationally and locally, some critics have raised issues with regard to some aspects of the process of relying on legislation. And I'd like to outline a couple of those aspects, and some of them might sound familiar to you. The first is the breadth of the agenda that's identified by the various public policy committees. And I'll take this from the perspective of the Bishops' Conference. I'm sure something similar happens at the state. Let me mention some of those. Abortion and life issues, communications, domestic policy, education, immigration and refugee issues, international justice and peace, marriage and family life, and religious liberty concerns. And each one of those has many sub-issues, as you can imagine. And there's a committee of bishops that monitors each of those areas. Now, with that broad of an agenda, the bishops on the national level are sometimes almost daily reacting to legislation. So the logical answer might seem to be prioritize the issues. But since each committee of the conference has its own priorities, committees have a hard time prioritizing within their own committee. Prioritization among committees is a much more difficult process. It's very difficult. Oh, that tells me I'm coming close. That leads me to the second and related challenge, which I mentioned before, the comparative moral weight of the issues. Now, traditionally, this challenge has been characterized as pro-life versus social justice. Unfortunately, in some quarters of the church, groups identified with either set of issues have caused division and dissension. Some of you will remember that there was an effort in the 1980s from Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago called Bringing the Issues Together Under a Consistent Ethic of Life. Now, that may have been a good theological construct, but it was a terrible political strategy, and that was because some Catholics and Catholic politicians hijacked the effort by arguing that what this showed was that all issues are of the same weight, and they could choose which issues to support or oppose and still be in union with the church, which we know is not true. Another related concern is the issue of specificity, and that is the extent to which bishops get involved in every issue, and whether or not some of those issues could have various sides where people could disagree. And if you recall from my summary of Gaudium et Spes, the document says that there are certain ranges of issues where it would be helpful if people discussed those and sort of came to their own conclusions. Now, the difficulty there is, where do you make the line of demarcation between issues where the church must be involved and issues where people of goodwill could disagree? You saw in the healthcare debate, when there's a life issue, it's an easy decision to make. When it's another issue that has a life issue within it, then we get the fractures. So there has been a question whether the emphasis on legislation is itself appropriate when so many of the most vexing issues have deep cultural roots. And as I mentioned before, Gaudium et Spes places particular emphasis on the development of culture. The current debate about marriage is about culture. We have to figure out a way to take on the culture and to continue to be what we are in most cases, which is a countercultural people. And I'll give you two good examples. The pro-life movement is a countercultural movement. The current effort to end the use of the death penalty is a countercultural movement. So the challenge is for the church to be engaged with the culture, but not controlled by the culture. On marriage, some say that we've already lost considerable ground on this issue. Recovering that ground will take a major cultural shift, particularly with the media, which has embraced same-sex relationships in movies, TV sitcoms and dramas, and even commercials. Finally, I'd like to talk about the challenge of the laity and getting the laity to be involved. In the 50 years since the Council, we've seen an explosion of ecclesial lay ministry, and it has enriched our church in countless ways. The bishops, in fact, wrote a document called Co-Workers in the Vineyard of the Lord, which recognizes and affirms the great work of ecclesial lay ministry. But what I haven't seen is a comparable engagement of lay Catholics as laity in their various roles in society. This is something that's a little more common in Europe. For example, there's a community called St. Egidio, which is a lay organization formed in 1968, headquartered in Italy, in 70 countries with 60,000 members. There just isn't anything like that in the United States. The church doesn't have this kind of a tradition. It has, in the years that I've worked in the church, there have been various efforts to organize laity. What tends to happen is the laity, when organized, then want to bring about change in the church rather than change in the culture. Now, there has been some improvement in this. Let me point to two organizations. One called Legatus, which for 25 years has provided an environment for its members to become ambassadors for the Catholic faith, and the other called the Catholic Association of Latino Leaders, which is a recently organized group that seeks to share the truths of the gospel and the values of Latino culture. But in my own mind, the jury is still out on how best to engage the laity in reflecting on their role as lay Catholics in the culture. The final challenge, which I've alluded to throughout here, is the challenge of the relationship with government. Many of our institutions, as you know, rely on government, particularly for their financial support. And those who establish these institutions, whether they be education, social services, hospitals, many years ago probably did so at a time when governments were more tolerant of faith-based institutions. So they willingly accepted government partnership and support since it did not interfere with their ministries. We're no longer at that point now. We no longer have governments that are friendly to faith-based organizations and are willing to allow us to do those services and still remain faithful to our mission. So let me go back to that quote. Gaudium et Spes warned that the church should not place her trust in the privileges offered by civil authority, and she should not take advantage of that, even if it becomes clear that their use will cast doubt on the sincerity of her witness. So the church may now have to evaluate how it funds and supports its health, educational, and social services in light of the current threats to religious liberty. Obviously, all of these challenges could not have been anticipated by the writers of Gaudium et Spes. But when the writers said that the church must examine the signs of the times and interpret them in the light of the gospel, they anticipated that the signs of the times would change with each generation, but the gospel message would remain the same. And so in conclusion, I would like to thank you for allowing me to express some of my own thinking in the context of this topic. While I confess that I don't have the answers to those neuralgic issues and those challenges that I lay before you, I hope I've sparked some of your own thinking as you continue to live out this year of faith. Thank you very much.